The year was 1884, and the wind across the Dakota plains had a voice. It was not a gentle thing. It was a mournful howl that scoured the land, stripping the soil from the bones of the earth and carrying the dust of lonely miles to claw at the sod walls of Esther Hale's world. Her world had become very small. It was the packed dirt floor of the soddy, the single greased paper window that let in a milky, sorrowful light, and the thin, patched quilt on her cot. Beyond that was the prairie, a vast, indifferent ocean of grass that had swallowed her husband, Henry, and then her daughter, little 7-year-old Clara, taking them both in the space of a single brutal winter. Grief, Esther had learned, was not an emotion. It was a physical presence. It had weight, a density that settled in her bones and made the simple act of rising in the morning a monumental effort. It had a taste, like ash and rust, that coated her tongue. It had a sound, the ceaseless whisper of the wind that seemed to speak in the voices of those she had lost. She moved through her days in a state of suspended animation, a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. The routines of survival were all that remained, checking the snares that were almost always empty, hauling water from the creek a half-mile away, mending clothes that were more patch than fabric. Her isolation was absolute. The nearest town, a miserable collection of false-fronted buildings called Providence, was a 2-day walk, and she had no reason to go. The last time she had been there, months ago, the faces of the townsfolk had been a gallery of pity and judgment. They saw a woman alone, a failure. Reverend Miller had spoken to her of God's inscrutable will, his words meant to comfort but landing like stones. He implied that their tragedy was a test, or perhaps a punishment. She had looked at his well-fed face and his clean, starched collar and felt a chasm open between them, a gulf of experience that no words could ever bridge. She had returned to her soddy, to the silence, and had not looked back. The prairie, in its honesty, was a kinder companion than the veiled contempt of men. Now, hunger was a constant companion, a dull ache that had sharpened into a predator's bite. The last of the flour was gone. The salted pork had vanished weeks ago. All she had left in the world was a single, fist-sized crust of bread, hard as a rock, saved from a meager portion she had made days before. She had been hoarding it, rationing tiny crumbs to herself, trying to stretch the sensation of food across the yawning emptiness of her belly. It was her final anchor to the world of the living. When it was gone, she knew, a part of her would be gone too. The finality of it was a cold, smooth stone in her gut. She sat on the single stool in her home, the crust of bread held loosely in her lap. The wind outside shrieked, a wild thing tearing at the roof. Esther closed her eyes, and for a moment she allowed herself to remember. Henry, his hands calloused but gentle, building this very soddy, his laughter echoing against the immense sky. Clara, her hair the color of sun-cured hay, chasing grasshoppers in the tall grass, her squeals of delight the only music this land had ever offered. The memories were daggers, each one a fresh wound. It was easier to feel nothing, to let the grey numbness take over. She had become a creature of muted colors, her spirit as leached of vibrancy as the winter landscape. It was then that she heard it, a sound that did not belong. It was not the wind, not the cry of a hawk, not the distant yip of a coyote. It was a human sound, small and fragile, nearly stolen by the gale, a whimper, a cry. Esther's heart, a sluggish and heavy thing in her chest, gave a painful lurch. Her first instinct was fear, a cold spike that shot through her. She was a woman alone, vulnerable. Any stranger was a threat. She remained perfectly still, her knuckles white where she gripped the stool, her ears straining against the roar of the wind. There it was again, closer this time, the unmistakable sound of a child crying. She rose slowly, every muscle tense. She crept to the heavy plank door and pressed her ear against it. The sound was just outside, a thin thread of despair woven into the fabric of the storm. It was a sound she knew intimately, the sound of a world shattered, of a small heart breaking. It was the sound Clara had made when the fever took hold, a sound that was seared into her soul. Against all reason, against every instinct for self-preservation that screamed at her to stay inside, to bar the door and ignore it, she lifted the heavy wooden latch. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it back against the sod wall with a deafening crack. A maelstrom of dust and dead leaves exploded into the small room, blinding her. When her vision cleared, she saw her, a small child, no older than 5 or 6, standing just a few feet from the threshold. The child was Sioux, her skin the color of rich earth, her dark hair whipped into a frenzy by the wind. She wore a simple deerskin dress, inadequate for the biting cold, and her small feet were bare. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, her dark eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to swallow the light. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. For a long moment, the two of them simply stared at each other across the threshold of Esther's desolation. In the child's face, Esther saw not an Indian, not a stranger, not a threat, but the universal language of childhood fear. The prejudice she had absorbed from the world, the fearful stories told in town about the Sioux, all of it crumbled to dust in the face of this one small, weeping human being. The child took a shuddering breath, her small shoulders shaking with a sob that was swallowed by the wind. Esther's mind was a battlefield. The voice of Providence warned her, spoke of savages and danger. Her own fear counseled caution, telling her to close the door, that the child's people must be near, that getting involved was a fool's errand. But another voice, one she had not heard in a very long time, rose from the depths of her grief. It was the voice of a mother. It saw only a lost child, cold and afraid. She moved without thinking, her body acting on an impulse that her weary mind could not suppress. She stepped out into the wind, her own thin dress whipping around her legs. She knelt in the dirt, bringing herself down to the child's level. She held out a hand, palm open, a gesture she hoped would transcend language. "It's all right," she whispered, the words torn away by the wind, but the gentleness of her tone hanging in the air between them. "You're safe." The little girl flinched, but did not run. Her crying subsided into hitched, watery breaths as she watched Esther with an unnerving intensity. Her eyes, dark and deep, seemed to see right through Esther's skin, past the hunger and the exhaustion, and into the hollow space where a mother's heart used to be. Esther felt a pang of her own hunger, sharp and insistent. The child must be starving, and then she remembered. The crust of bread, her last piece of food. The one thing that stood between her and utter emptiness. She hesitated for only a second. It was a second that contained all her fear, all her despair, and all her loss. To give it away was to give up her last thread of hope for herself. Then she looked again at the child's tear-stained face, at the tremor in her small body, and she saw Clara. She saw her own daughter, lost and alone in a cold world. The choice was no choice at all. Slowly, she rose and went back inside the soddy. The little girl watched her go, a fresh wave of fear crossing her features. Esther returned a moment later, the hard crust of bread in her hand. She knelt again, holding it out. It was not a grand gesture. It was a small, desperate offering from one starving soul to another. The child, whose name was Istus, stared at the bread, then at Esther's face. She saw the gauntness of the woman's cheeks, the deep, sorrowful lines around her eyes. Even in her young mind, she understood that this was not a gift of plenty. She saw the sacrifice. Hesitantly, she reached out with a small, trembling hand and took the bread. Her fingers were ice-cold against Esther's skin. Istus did not devour it. She clutched it to her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. She looked at Esther one last time, and in her dark eyes, something shifted. The terror receded, replaced by a flicker of solemn understanding. Then, without a sound, she turned and ran, disappearing into the grey, swirling curtain of dust and grass, almost as quickly as she had appeared. Esther remained kneeling in the dirt for a long time, the cold seeping into her bones. The wind howled around her, mocking the emptiness in her hand and the new, more profound emptiness in her stomach. She had just given away her own survival. A profound wave of despair washed over her, so powerful it almost drowned her. It was a foolish, sentimental act, a death sentence. She staggered back into the soddy and pushed the heavy door shut, leaning against it as the latch fell into place. The silence inside was suddenly heavier, more absolute. The space where the bread had been on her small shelf was a gaping void. She sank onto her stool, wrapping her arms around her middle as if to hold herself together. The hunger was no longer a dull ache. It was a living creature inside her, tearing at her with sharp claws. That night was the longest of her life. Sleep offered no escape, only feverish dreams of food she could not reach, and the face of the crying child morphing into the face of her own daughter. She woke in the pre-dawn grayness, feeling hollowed out, as if the wind had finally scoured her clean of everything, even hope. She had done a kind thing, perhaps, but the prairie did not reward kindness. It rewarded strength, foresight, and ruthless self-preservation. She had failed on all counts. She did not bother to rise. She lay on her cot, listening to the wind, which had finally begun to quiet. She felt a deep lethargy, a strange sense of peace that came with utter resignation. There were no more choices to make, no more struggles to endure. She had reached the end. She thought of Henry and Clara, not with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with a dull, distant longing. Soon, she thought, she would be with them. The idea was not frightening, it was almost a relief. It was the sound that roused her first, a low, rhythmic tremor that was not a sound at all but a feeling. It vibrated up from the earth, through the packed dirt floor, and into the wooden legs of her cot. It was a deep, resonant drumming, like 1,000 giant heartbeats. Esther pushed herself up on one elbow, her own heart beginning to pound with a renewed primal fear. The drumming grew louder, becoming a rumble, then a roar. It was the sound of thunder, but the sky outside her small window was a pale, clear blue. This was the thunder of the earth itself. She scrambled from the cot, her weakness forgotten in a surge of adrenaline. She stumbled to the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the latch. She had to see. She pulled the door open, a crack, and peered out, and the world fell away. The horizon was gone. In its place was a living, moving wall of horses, hundreds of them, more than she could count. They were a river of horseflesh, a sea of churning manes and powerful muscle, their hooves churning the prairie soil into a cloud of dust that rose to meet the morning sun. There were paints and bays, roans and blacks, a breathtaking spectacle of power and wildness that seemed to shake the very foundations of the sky. And in front of them, sitting motionless on their own mounts, were warriors. Perhaps 50 of them, their faces grim and unreadable, their presence radiating an aura of immense, controlled power. They were armed. Lances tipped with stone and steel caught the morning light. Bows were slung across their backs. They were not a hunting party, they were an army. Esther's breath caught in her throat. Her blood ran cold. This was it. This was the end she had feared. They had come for her, for the child. Perhaps they thought she had harmed her, or taken her. The foolish act of kindness was about to cost her her life. She shrank back from the door, her body trembling uncontrollably. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The soddy that had been her shelter now felt like a tomb. One man began to move forward from the line of warriors. He rode a magnificent black stallion that seemed carved from shadow and fury. He moved with an unhurried, deliberate grace that was more terrifying than any charge. As he drew closer, she could see the detail of his person. He was a man in his prime, his face a mask of stern authority, framed by 2 long braids threaded with eagle feathers. His chest was broad, his shoulders powerful. He wore a breastplate of polished bone, and his eyes, when they finally fixed on her small hovel, were as sharp and penetrating as a hawk's. He carried no expression of overt hostility, only an unnerving, absolute stillness. He reined in his stallion about 20 paces from her door. The horse snorted, its breath pluming in the crisp morning air. The silence that fell was profound, broken only by the soft stamping of hooves and the rustle of the wind in the grass. The army of horses and warriors behind him was utterly still, a silent, waiting judgment. Esther knew this was the leader. This had to be the child's father. She forced herself to stand, to step out from the doorway into the full light of day. If she was to die, she would not die cowering in the dark. She would face it on her feet. She straightened her thin shoulders, clasped her trembling hands in front of her, and met the man's gaze. He watched her for a long moment, his eyes sweeping over her, taking in the dilapidated soddy, her worn dress, the gaunt hollows of her face. He saw everything. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, handing the reins of his stallion to a warrior who had moved up beside him. He began to walk toward her, his footsteps on the dry earth, the only sound in the world. Every instinct screamed at Esther to run, to scream, to beg, but she was frozen, held in place by the sheer force of his presence. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that she could see the lines of experience etched around his eyes, the deep intelligence that burned within them. He was a man who had seen much of life and death. And beside him, peeking out from behind his leg, was the little girl, Istas. She was no longer crying. She was dressed in warm, new skins, and she held the hard crust of bread in her hand like a sacred object. She looked at Esther, not with fear, but with a quiet, solemn recognition. The man's gaze followed his daughter's. He looked at the bread she held, and then his eyes returned to Esther's face. The silence stretched, becoming so taut that Esther felt it might snap and tear the world apart. She braced herself for the accusation, for the condemnation, for the sentence. When he finally spoke, his voice was not what she expected. It was not a harsh bark of command, but a low, deep rumble, like stones moving at the bottom of a river. He spoke in English, his words careful and measured, yet carrying the weight of the wilderness. He did not ask what she had done. He did not ask why his daughter was there. He looked deep into her eyes, with a gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of her grief and hunger, and see the raw, flickering ember of her spirit. And he asked his single question. "I see the spirits of many winters in your eyes," Tashunka said, his voice quiet but resonant. "Your own fields lie fallow. Why did you give my daughter the last of your spring?" The question struck Esther with the force of a physical blow. It was so unexpected, so poetic, so deeply perceptive, that it shattered her defenses completely. He saw. He did not just see the act. He saw the cost. He saw the emptiness from which the gift had been given. He was not asking for an explanation of events. He was asking for an accounting of her soul. Tears she did not know she had left to cry welled in her eyes, blurring the formidable figure before her. The carefully constructed walls of stoicism she had built around her heart crumbled into dust. All the pain, the loss, the loneliness of the past year rushed into the space his question had created. "My spring is gone," she whispered, her voice cracking, raw with unshed grief. "I had a daughter. Her name was Clara. The fever took her. It took her in the winter." She gestured vaguely at the vast, empty prairie. "I planted her on the hill, beside her father. There is no more spring for me. There is only what is left." She paused, taking a ragged breath, the confession tearing from her throat. "When I saw your daughter, she was crying, and for a moment I saw my Clara, cold, alone." Her voice broke entirely, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. A mother's heart does not forget the sound of a child's tears. It does not matter whose child it is. The bread, she looked at the crust in Istas's hand. It was nothing. It was the only thing I had left to give. Giving it to her, it was like giving it to my own. It was the last thing I could do for my daughter. She finished, her words hanging in the immense silence. She had laid her soul bare before this powerful, intimidating stranger. She had no more defenses, no more pride. There was only the raw, unvarnished truth of her broken heart. She lowered her head, fully expecting the end. Tashunka did not move for a long time. He stood like a figure carved from the rock of the plains, his face unreadable. He looked at this pale, starving woman who spoke the language of grief, a language that transcended tribe and tongue. He had come expecting to find a threat, or at best, a puzzle. He had found instead a reflection of the world's deep sorrow and an act of courage so profound it defied logic. He understood that she had not given his daughter bread. She had given her the ghost of a mother's love. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and touched his own chest, a gesture of profound respect. He turned his head and spoke to his warriors in the swift, flowing language of the Lakota. His words were not a command for violence, but an order of a different kind. He turned back to Esther. "The heart that gives when it has nothing," he said, his voice softer now, "is the strongest heart on this land. You honored my daughter. My people will now honor you." He stepped back and raised his hand. What happened next was a blur to Esther. The warriors began to move with a quiet, efficient purpose. Several men dismounted and began unloading supplies from pack horses she hadn't even noticed. They brought smoked buffalo meat, sacks of dried corn and berries, warm buffalo robes and firewood. They laid these things gently near her doorway, not as charity, but as a tribute. Tashunka then walked to his own magnificent stallion. From a leather pouch on his saddle, he withdrew a small, intricately beaded necklace and walked back to Esther. "This was my mother's," he said, holding it out to her. "It is a charm for a strong heart. Wear it. No one from any nation who sees it will bring you harm. You are under the protection of Tashunka." He did not wait for her to take it. He gently placed the necklace over her head, its cool, smooth beads a startling sensation against her skin. He then gestured to the vast herd of horses. "These are my wealth," he said. "They are the strength of my people. I brought them to show you the honor you have earned." He looked at her, a faint, almost imperceptible softening in his eyes. "You have no need for 500 horses, but a strong heart should not walk alone." He gave another command. One of his warriors separated a single horse from the herd, a beautiful, gentle-eyed mare, the color of autumn leaves. The warrior led it forward and tied its reins to the post beside Esther's door. "She will be your companion," Tashunka said. "She knows this land. She will not leave you." With that he turned. He walked back to his stallion, swung himself onto its back with effortless grace, and looked at Esther one last time. His daughter, Istus, still clutching the bread, was lifted up to sit in front of him. The little girl's dark eyes met Esther's over her father's arm, and for the first time she offered a small, shy smile. Tashunka raised his hand once more. The massive herd of horses, the river of life that had descended upon her, began to turn. The thunder of their hooves started again, not as a threat, but as a departure. The warriors fell into formation, and the entire magnificent procession began to move away, flowing back toward the horizon from which they had come. Esther stood, stunned, amidst the pile of life-giving supplies. The necklace was a warm weight on her chest, the leather reins of the mare cool in her hand. She watched them go, the dust of their passage catching the sunlight like a golden mist. She watched until they were just a dark line on the horizon, and then nothing. The silence that returned to the prairie was different. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, of absence, of grief. It was a silence that was full. It held the echo of hoofbeats, the memory of a deep voice, the weight of an honor so great she could barely comprehend it. The wind whispered through the grass, but it no longer sounded like the voices of the dead. It sounded like the breathing of the land itself. She looked at the provisions, a bounty that would see her through the next winter and beyond. She looked at the gentle mare, who nudged her hand softly with its muzzle. She reached up and touched the necklace, its beads a tangible link to the incredible events of the morning. Her grief for Henry and Clara was still there. It would always be a part of her, a landscape inside her soul. But it was no longer the only thing. Around it, something new had been planted. A seed of connection, of hope, sown by an act of desperation and watered by an act of profound, unexpected grace. Esther Hale, The woman who had nothing stood in the morning sun and understood that she had been given back her world. It was not the world she had lost, but a new one, wider and more mysterious than she could ever have imagined. A world where a single crust of bread could summon a thunder of horses, and where the deepest sorrow could be met with the highest honor. For the first time in a very long time, she looked out at the vast, empty prairie and did not feel alone. She felt watched over. She felt home.